Welcome to Preservation Oaks, the podcast where we invite you to step away from the bustle of everyday life. Settle in and relax, and take a moment to leave the familiar behind as we explore the hidden gems of America that preserve our cultural past. We call them our Preservation Oaks, and with each episode, we'll journey to a different corner of the country, where we'll discover the unique histories, landscapes, and communities that make up our nation. We'll visit with local museums, historical and genealogical societies. They are the stewards of these stories. They preserve the legacy of each place like precious pieces of fabric in a quilt that binds the freedom-loving, hardworking people in this country together. So, slow down, grab a beverage, open your mind, and let us take you on a tour of the fascinating histories and heartfelt traditions that lie just beyond the horizon. This is Preservation Oaks, where every story is a stitch in the fabric of our shared culture. Now, join our host, Sean Radcliffe, as he uncovers another thread in the tapestry of America's heritage and what it takes to preserve it.
Welcome to Preservation Oaks, where history lives and voices echo through time. I'm your host, Sean Radcliffe. This episode is not about a museum, a historical or genealogical society. It's not about a battlefield, a pioneer trail, or a preserved courthouse. It is about something quieter and perhaps more revealing. It is about crime. Not crime as spectacle, not crime as entertainment, but crime as a historical rearview mirror. From 1926 to 2026, one full century, the nature of crime has changed dramatically. But even more dramatically, the methods we use to identify it, investigate it, and respond to it have evolved. From patrol officers walking city blocks to federal agents chasing bootleggers, to intelligence networks tracing influence, to financial investigators following money, to digital forensics examining metadata, and now to auditors and algorithms examining entire systems, crime has moved, and so has oversight. We're taking that journey, calmly, historically, thoughtfully, because history is messy. People and systems evolve. This episode discusses historical crime, surveillance, and law enforcement practices across the 20th and 21st centuries. Our goal is historical reflection, not political commentary. To understand the transformation of crime and its detection over this century, we must first recognize the profound shifts in society itself. In 1926, America was in the throes of the Roaring Twenties, yet beneath the jazz and prosperity, a complex criminal ecosystem was taking shape. Prohibition had created unprecedented opportunities for organized crime, while technological limitations meant investigations relied primarily on human intelligence, physical evidence, and sometimes brute force. The criminal landscape of 1926 was characterized by physical violence and territorial control, localized operations with limited geographical reach, simple financial schemes like cash-based transactions, limited technological sophistication, and clear hierarchies in criminal organizations. Contrast this with 2026, where crime has become increasingly digital and borderless, financially complex and often laundered through sophisticated networks, technologically advanced, utilizing encryption and anonymization, decentralized and networked rather than hierarchical, and systemic rather than individualistic. The methods of detection and investigation have undergone perhaps even more dramatic transformation than the crimes themselves. Where once a detective's most valuable tool was the notebook and their ability to conduct interviews, today's investigators must understand blockchain technology, data analytics, and cross-border financial regulations. This evolution can be traced through several distinct phases. The first of which is the physical era from 1926 to the 1950s. Investigation relied on eyewitness testimony, physical evidence collection, and the emerging science of forensics. The fingerprint became revolutionary identification technology. Then, number two is the organizational era from 1950s to the 1980s. As criminal enterprises became more sophisticated, so did investigative techniques. Wiretapping, surveillance, and financial tracking became essential tools. Then there was the digital dawn, from the 1980s to the 2000s. Computers entered both criminal and investigative worlds. The first digital forensics units emerged, struggling to keep pace with technological advancement. Then there was the data revolution from the 2000s to 2016, where massive data collection and analysis transformed investigation. Predictive policing, financial pattern recognition, and digital surveillance became commonplace. And lastly, there was the algorithmic age from 2016 to 2026, where machine learning and artificial intelligence now assist in identifying patterns humans might miss. Investigations increasingly focus on systemic vulnerabilities rather than individual actors. The evolution of crime and its detection serves as a powerful indicator of broader societal changes. As our economic systems became more complex, so did financial crimes. As technology advanced, so did technological offenses. As globalization connected markets, it also connected criminal networks. This episode will explore not just the what and how of criminal evolution, but the why. Why did certain forms of crime emerge when they did? What social or technological conditions enabled them? How did our responses to crime shape our institutions? And perhaps most importantly, what does this century-long transformation tell us about where we're headed? Because crime, like history, is not merely a series of events to be cataloged. It's a reflection of our values, our vulnerabilities, and our collective response to transgression. By examining this century of criminal evolution, we gain insight not just into the underworld, but into the very structures of society itself. We begin our journey in 1926 with bootleggers racing along darkened roads, federal agents in hot pursuit, and a nation struggling to enforce a law many of its citizens refused to follow. From there, we'll trace the path to our present day, where algorithms monitor transactions. Investigators examine code and logs rather than crime scenes, and the very definition of criminality continues to evolve. Join me now as we explore this fascinating transformation, how the methods of crime changed, and more importantly, how we changed in response. Because in understanding this evolution, we understand something fundamental about ourselves, our institutions, and the constant tension between order and transgression that has shaped our world. Now we'll step back in time to 1926, when America's criminal landscape was about to change forever, and the methods of detection would begin a century-long transformation that continues to this day. All right?
Part 1. In 1926, crime had faces.
Picture 1926. America is in the grip of prohibition. Alcohol is illegal. Speakeasies operate behind unmarked doors. Smuggling networks span lakes, coasts, and backroads. Bootleggers become notorious. Crime in this era is visible, personal, physical. You know who runs the illegal bar. You know who supplies the liquor. You know which gang controls which neighborhood. Law enforcement is primarily local. City police, county sheriffs, State troopers. At the federal level, the young Federal Bureau of Investigation is still defining its authority and capabilities. The United States Marshals Service handles fugitives and federal warrants. Crime identification relies on informants, physical surveillance, eyewitness accounts, paper ledgers, and fingerprints. If someone pulled off a kidnapping or robbed a bank, witnesses saw them. If someone smuggled liquor, barrels had to move physically. Crime required presence. It required confrontation. And law enforcement required proximity. Oversight was human scale. You could walk your beat. You could know your suspects. Crime was identified by watching people. To understand crime in 1926 is to understand the unintended consequences of the 18th Amendment. What began as a moral crusade had, by its 6th year, created the very conditions for a criminal ecosystem unprecedented in American history. The demand for alcohol never diminished. It simply went underground. And in those shadows, a new breed of entrepreneur emerged. The bootlegger wasn't just a criminal. He was an innovator. He developed new routes for transportation, fast cars to outrun law enforcement, new methods for concealment, and new networks for distribution. The rum runners along the Atlantic coast perfected the art of nighttime navigation, using signal lights and coded communications. The Midwest bootleggers became masters of rural logistics, converting farm equipment into transport vehicles and modifying barns into storage facilities. In cities like Chicago, New York, and Detroit, organized crime structures evolved to meet the demands of distribution. What had been loosely affiliated street gangs transformed into sophisticated organizations with defined territories, supply chains, and enforcement mechanisms. The neighborhood boss wasn't just a thug, he was a businessman managing operations, supply lines, and personnel. The criminal investigation of 1926 was a fundamentally physical endeavor. When a crime occurred, the scene itself was the primary source of information. Bank robbers left footprints. Speakeasies left receipts. Smugglers left tracks. Consider a typical bootlegging operation investigation. It might begin with an informant, a disgruntled former employee, a rival gang member, or simply a concerned citizen. This human intelligence would lead to physical surveillance, officers watching a location from across the street, noting who entered and left, at what times, and with what cargo. If probable cause developed, a raid might follow. The evidence collected would be entirely physical: bottles, barrels, accounting books, weapons. Each piece of evidence was tangible, observable, and comprehensible to the average juror. Fingerprinting, while revolutionary for its time, was still in its relative infancy. The FBI's fingerprint database, established in 1924, contained just over 100,000 prints by 1926, a fraction of what it would become. Classification and matching were manual processes requiring skilled technicians and significant time. The typical police department in 1926 bore little resemblance to its modern counterpart. Most officers walked beats, establishing intimate knowledge of their neighborhoods and the people who inhabited them. This proximity created both advantages and vulnerabilities. The advantage was deep community knowledge. Officer O'Malley might know that Mr. Johnson's garage was unusually busy on Tuesday nights, or that a particular vehicle regularly traveled the back road near the Canadian border. This granular understanding was the primary detection tool available. The disadvantage was corruption. The same proximity that enabled effective policing also created opportunities for bribery, intimidation, and compromised ethics. In many cities, the relationship between police and organized crime was not adversarial, but symbiotic. Officers might receive regular payments to ignore certain operations, or even provide protection for them. This local focus meant that criminal operations crossing jurisdictional boundaries, particularly those of the sophisticated bootlegging networks, often operated with impunity. A smuggler might move liquor from Canada to Chicago, passing through multiple jurisdictions, each with limited knowledge of or authority over the entire operation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, still known as the Bureau of Investigation until 1935, was in a transitional period in 1926. Under Director J. Edgar Hoover, appointed in 1924, the Bureau was professionalizing its methods and expanding its jurisdiction. The Bureau's primary focus in 1926 was on federal crimes, particularly those crossing state lines. Bootlegging operations naturally fell within this purview, and Hoover's agents began developing the investigative techniques that would later become standard practice: systematic record-keeping, forensic analysis, and interstate coordination. Yet the Bureau remained limited in resources and authority. With fewer than 500 agents nationwide, it could hardly serve as the primary enforcement mechanism against an enterprise as vast as illegal alcohol distribution. Its role was largely supplemental, assisting local authorities when requested, or pursuing cases with clear federal jurisdiction. Perhaps most fundamentally different from today was the social context of crime in 1926. In an era before mass media saturation and before the digital anonymization of human interaction, crime was part of community knowledge. The local speakeasy wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was a social institution. Its patrons weren't just lawbreakers. They were neighbors, business owners, and sometimes even local officials. This created a complex social dynamic where criminality and community coexisted in an uneasy equilibrium. The gangster wasn't an abstract figure, but a known personality. In Chicago, Al Capone was becoming a celebrity, part criminal, part businessman, part philanthropist. This public recognition of criminal figures created a strange dynamic where crime had not just faces, but public personas. The methods of 1926, while effective within their limitations, faced inherent constraints. The human-scale approach to policing meant that investigative capacity was directly tied to personnel numbers. A city could only investigate as many cases as it had detectives. The reliance on physical evidence meant that crimes without tangible traces, particularly financial crimes that left no paper trail, were nearly impossible to prosecute. The jurisdictional fragmentation meant that sophisticated criminal operations could simply play different authorities against each other. Most significantly, the personal nature of crime and policing created vulnerabilities. An informant could be silenced. A witness could be intimidated. An officer could be compromised. The entire system depended on individual integrity and courage, qualities that, while admirable, were not always sufficient against the organized power of criminal enterprises. Even as the criminal justice system of 1926 operated within these physical and personal constraints, the seeds of transformation were being planted. The same year saw the establishment of the first forensic crime laboratory in Los Angeles. The Bureau of Investigation was beginning to develop systematic methods for criminal identification. The technological limitations that defined crime in 1926 would soon begin to dissolve. The automobile, already transforming criminal logistics, would become faster and more reliable. The telephone, already in use, would become more widespread. The radio, already broadcasting news, would soon broadcast descriptions of wanted criminals. What characterized crime in 1926 was not just its physicality, but its transparency. Criminals operated in a world where their activities, however illicit, were visible and knowable. The bootleggers' barrels, the speakeasies' patrons, the gangsters' territories, all could be observed, documented, and potentially prosecuted. This transparency would soon fade. As the century progressed, crime would become increasingly abstract, financial, and digital. The face of crime would literally disappear, first behind corporate structures, then behind computer screens, and finally behind algorithms and encryption systems. But in 1926, crime still had faces. It had addresses. It had physical manifestations. And it had a relationship with the communities in which it operated, a relationship that would define not just criminal justice of the era, but the very nature of American society itself. As we move forward from this tangible world of 1926, we'll trace how crime gradually lost its face, how it moved from the visible to the invisible, from the physical to the abstract, and how law enforcement would be forced to evolve in response. The journey from bootleggers to bureaucracy begins here, in a world where crime could still be seen, touched, and known by the communities it affected.
Part 2. The 1930s, a national response.
The Great Depression intensified criminal activity. Kidnappings and bank robberies increase. Interstate fugitives exploited weak coordination between states. This era produces infamous figures, but more importantly, it produces reform. The FBI professionalizes under J. Edgar Hoover's leadership. Standardized training emerges. National fingerprint databases expand. Communication across state lines improves. The federal government begins to assert broader jurisdiction. Crime is no longer simply local. It can be interstate, national. Coordination becomes essential. Oversight grows from neighborhood patrol to national registry. This is the first major scaling of crime identification. The 1930s did not invent crime, but the Great Depression weaponized it. As banks failed and unemployment soared to unprecedented levels, reaching nearly 25% by 1933. The social fabric that had contained criminal behavior began to unravel. The line between honest citizen and desperate outlaw blurred as former farmers, factory workers, and businessmen turned to crime out of necessity. The iconic bank robber of this era was often a former soldier or farmer who saw financial institutions not as pillars of the community, but as symbols of an economic system that had failed them. When John Dillinger wrote letters to the press decrying the practices of banks that had foreclosed on family farms, he tapped into a reservoir of public resentment that made him, to many, more folk hero than villain. Kidnappings for ransom emerged as a particularly dark innovation of this period. The 1932 abduction of Charles Lindbergh's infant son shocked the nation and demonstrated how criminals could exploit the newfound mobility of automobiles and the limitations of jurisdictional boundaries to evade capture. As local economies collapsed, criminal enterprises became increasingly mobile. A gang could rob a bank in Iowa, escape across state lines into Illinois, and find themselves legally out of reach of the pursuing authority. This jurisdictional patchwork created what amounted to safe havens for fugitives, simply by crossing an invisible line on a map. The automobile, once a novelty, became the essential tool of the criminal trade. Its speed and range transformed the nature of pursuit. A sheriff on horseback or in a Model T Ford was no match for a gang in a powerful V8 sedan with a full tank of gas. Criminals began to systematically plan their operations around jurisdictional boundaries, timing their crossings to maximize the confusion between different law enforcement agencies. This mobility required a corresponding mobility in law enforcement, a capability that simply did not exist in 1926. The response would fundamentally reshape American criminal justice. Just to level set, being a professional means having specialized knowledge and skills in a given area of expertise attained through training and education. It also means adhering to a specific set of ethical standards, maintaining accountability, and consistently demonstrating reliability and expertise in completion of the work. J. Edgar Hoover, appointed director of the Bureau of Investigation in 1924, recognized that the federal government's response to the crime wave required more than simply increasing manpower. It required a complete transformation of methodology, training, and jurisdiction. Under Hoover's leadership, the Bureau underwent what might be called bureaucratic professionalization. He established strict hiring standards, requiring agents to have legal training or accounting backgrounds. He implemented a rigorous training program at a newly established facility on the Marine Corps base in Quantico, Virginia. He introduced standardized procedures for evidence collection, case documentation, and interagency communication. Most significantly, Hoover fought for and won expanded jurisdiction for his agency. The 1932 kidnapping statute made taking a victim across state lines a federal crime. The 1934 Federal Bank Robbery Act gave the Bureau authority to investigate bank robberies at federally insured institutions. These were not minor adjustments. They represented a fundamental reordering of American law enforcement. If one innovation symbolizes the transformation of crime identification in the 1930s, it is the National Fingerprint Database. What had been a modest collection of 100,000 prints in 1926 would grow to over 2 million by the end of the decade. The process was systematic and methodical. The Bureau established a central repository for fingerprint cards collected from local and state agencies across the country. They developed a classification system, the Henry system, that allowed for efficient filing and retrieval. They trained technicians in the science of fingerprint analysis and established standards for what constituted a match. The impact was immediate and profound. A suspect arrested in Kansas for a minor offense could now be identified as the same person wanted for a bank robbery in Missouri. A set of latent prints from a crime scene in Ohio could be matched to a known criminal in Illinois. The anonymity that interstate mobility had provided criminals was rapidly eroding. The 1930s saw the first systematic use of technology to connect law enforcement agencies across distances. The teletype machine, essentially a remote typewriter connected by telephone wires, allowed for the near instantaneous transmission of information between bureau field offices and headquarters. This technological capability transformed the nature of pursuit. When a bank robbery occurred in one state, descriptions of the suspects and their vehicle could be broadcast to neighboring states within minutes. Wanted posters, once distributed by mail and often outdated upon arrival, could be transmitted electronically and printed locally. The Bureau also developed what would become the 10 Most Wanted Fugitives program in 1930, initially as an internal communication tool, but soon expanded for public distribution through newspapers and radio. This represented a new approach, leveraging public participation as a force multiplier for limited law enforcement resources. The transformation of crime identification in the 1930s was not merely technological or procedural. It was legal. Congress, responding to both the crime wave and Hoover's advocacy, passed a series of laws that fundamentally expanded federal jurisdiction in criminal matters. The National Motor Vehicle Theft Act of 1933 made transporting stolen vehicles across state lines a federal crime. The Federal Kidnapping Act of 1932, often called the Lindbergh Law, gave the Bureau jurisdiction in kidnapping cases where the victim was taken across state lines. These statutes established a principle that would guide federal law enforcement for decades. When criminal activity crossed state lines, it became a matter of federal concern. This legal expansion was controversial. Critics argued that it represented an overreach of federal power into matters traditionally reserved to states. Supporters countered that criminals were already operating across state lines, and that law enforcement needed the same authority to pursue them effectively. As crime and its investigation became national in scope, it also became national in consciousness. The exploits of figures like John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, and Machine Gun Kelly were followed not just locally, but nationally through newspaper coverage and radio broadcasts. Their capture or death became national events. This media attention served a dual purpose. It satisfied public fascination with the outlaw figures while simultaneously demonstrating the effectiveness of the newly professionalized federal law enforcement. When Hoover's agents captured or killed notorious criminals, the publicity reinforced the narrative of a competent, capable federal response to the crime wave. The cultural impact extended beyond mere entertainment. It shaped public perception of crime and its appropriate response. The image of the clean-cut, professional federal agent, dressed in a suit and tie, armed with a scientific approach rather than just a gun, became a powerful symbol of order in a disorderly time. The transformation of crime identification in the 1930s marked a fundamental shift in the relationship between criminality and oversight. Where once crime had been identified primarily through personal knowledge and physical presence, it was now increasingly identified through systematic documentation and technological connection. The gangster of 1926 had been known by face and reputation. The fugitive of 1936 was increasingly known by fingerprint and file. The local beat officer who knew his neighborhood by personal acquaintance was supplemented by the federal agent who knew the country by database and communication network. This was the first major scaling of crime identification, from neighborhood patrol to national registry. It established a pattern that would repeat throughout the century. As crime evolved in scale and sophistication, oversight would evolve in scope and methodology. The 1930s established another crucial precedent: the federal government as the coordinator of national crime identification. This role would expand in subsequent decades as crime became even more complex and jurisdictional boundaries even less relevant to criminal operations. As with any transformation, the professionalization and nationalization of crime identification in the 1930s created new vulnerabilities even as it solved old problems. The centralized systems that made identification more efficient also created centralized points of failure. The standardized procedures that improved consistency also created predictability that sophisticated criminals could exploit. Perhaps most significantly, the focus on interstate criminal activity drew attention and resources away from local crime that remained within jurisdictional boundaries. As the federal government became more capable at addressing certain types of crime, local law enforcement sometimes found itself with reduced support for the everyday crimes that affected most communities. These unintended consequences would become more apparent in subsequent decades as crime evolved yet again, finding new ways to exploit the very systems designed to contain it. The 1930s marked the end of an era, the time when crime could be contained within local boundaries and identified through personal acquaintance. As the decade closed, a new model was emerging: systematic, technological, and national. But this model would soon face new challenges as crime evolved from the physical to the financial, from the visible to the concealed. The journey from bootleggers to bureaucracy was just beginning.
Listen closely. I am warning you, darlings. Time is ticking. History isn't going to explore itself. Before it is too late, my clever ones, join a local historical or genealogical society today. Do it now.
I am General Matto Vandu Maximanus, from the planet you refer to as BD 114672C. I am the legate of the 2nd AB Picturus B region, governor of the approaches to NU Octantis AB, interplanetary consul, commander of the legions of AB Picturus A, 91 Aquari B, Mu Leonis B, and Gamma Librae B, and I listen to Preservation Oaks on Microstream Radio.
This is Preservation Oaks, and here's another Footnotes of History. Deep in the wilds of Oregon, on a cold December night in 1805, a small group of explorers made a choice that quietly changed history by taking a vote. The Lewis and Clark expedition, officially the Corps of Discovery, was nearing the end of its incredible journey across the continent. After traveling thousands of miles up the Missouri River, Over the Rocky Mountains and down the Columbia, they finally reached the Pacific Ocean in November 1805. Winter was setting in fast. The explorers, exhausted and soaked from constant rain, needed to decide where to camp until spring. They were deep in the Oregon wilderness, far from any government, and facing difficult conditions: cold, sickness, hunger, and endless dampness. So Meriwether Lewis and William Clark called a meeting of the entire Corps to choose their winter quarters. On November 24, 1805, the team gathered around the campfire. Each member had a voice: soldiers, hunters, laborers, and guides. They debated whether to camp on the north side of the Columbia River in what was then called Washington Territory, or to cross to the south, where game was said to be more plentiful. Then came the remarkable part. They voted. Every member, about 30 in all, was given a say. But unlike the military councils of the day, this vote was not limited to officers or white men. Among those who cast ballots were York, an enslaved man owned by William Clark, and Sacagawea, the Shoshone woman who had guided and interpreted for the Corps throughout their journey. It was, as historians believe, the first recorded election in U.S. history in which a woman and an enslaved person both participated equally. Their decision was unanimous. They would cross the river and build what became Fort Clatsop near present-day Astoria, Oregon. There, they endured a miserable but successful winter, preparing maps, journals, and specimens that would shape America's understanding of the West. Though the moment was brief and informal, it carried symbolic weight far beyond that campfire. At a time when slavery was legal, women had no political rights, and democracy itself was still an experiment, the Corps of Discovery acted on an instinct that would define the nation's character: that every voice on the frontier mattered. Lewis and Clark may not have realized it, but their simple act of inclusion, granting equal say to York and Sacagawea, foreshadowed struggles and triumphs that would take another 2 centuries to unfold. In that silent, rain-soaked vote, we glimpse the first spark of the broader American idea, that in moments of decision, every person deserves a voice. This has been another Footnotes of History, brought to you by Preservation Oaks. Because history isn't just written in capitals and courts, it's whispered around campfires, carried on votes of conscience, and preserved in the quiet courage of ordinary people.
9 out of 10 listeners agree. Preservation Oaks is the best podcast on the internet.
And now, back to Preservation Oaks.
Hiya! Before we get started with Part 3, I think it's important to provide some historical context. Just what is crime? Crime is not a fixed idea. It has never been. Across history, a crime has been whatever a society, at a given moment in time, decides it cannot tolerate. In the earliest human communities, there were no written laws. Crime was defined by custom, survival, and shared understanding. To steal food, betray the group, or commit violence was not just wrong, It threatened the survival of everyone. Justice was immediate, often harsh, and deeply personal. As civilizations formed, in places like Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, crime became something more formal. Laws were written. Punishments were codified. One of the earliest examples, the Code of Hammurabi, made it clear that crime was no longer just a personal matter. It was an offense against order, authority, and the state. In the classical world, societies like ancient Rome expanded this idea further. Crime became tied to citizenship, governance, and public order. The state claimed the authority not only to define crime, but to investigate and punish it systematically. Through the medieval period, crime often blurred with morality and religion. Acts were criminal not only because they broke laws, but because they were seen as offenses against divine order. Justice could be inconsistent, shaped by power, status, and belief. Then came the rise of modern nation-states. Laws became more standardized. Legal systems evolved toward evidence, procedure, and rights. Crime shifted from being a personal or moral violation to something defined through codified statutes and legal frameworks. And then, in the modern era, everything changed again. The 20th and 21st centuries introduced crimes that earlier societies could never have imagined. Cybercrime, identity theft, financial manipulation across borders. Crime no longer requires proximity. It requires access. Today, crime is global, digital, and constantly evolving. What is considered criminal continues to change alongside technology, culture, and power structures. Because at its core, crime has always been this: a line drawn by society, shifting over time, marking the boundary between what is permitted and what is not. Laws are the standards by which a society defines order, protects its people, and maintains stability. Crime is what happens when those standards are broken, when an individual, or even an organization, crosses the boundary set by written and accepted law. So, what is a criminal? If crime evolves, so too does the idea of a criminal. In early societies, a criminal was simply someone who broke the trust of the group, often judged immediately and punished without formal process. In ancient civilizations, the criminal became an offender against authority, someone who violated the laws of rulers or the state. During the medieval period, a criminal might also be seen as a sinner, someone who had broken both earthly and divine law. As legal systems matured, particularly in the modern era, the definition became more precise. A criminal was no longer just someone accused or suspected, but someone proven, through process and evidence, to have violated the law. And today, even that definition continues to evolve. Modern systems recognize complexity, intent, circumstance, and rights. A criminal is not simply defined by the act, but by legal judgment within a structured system designed to balance justice and fairness. What we call crime and who we call a criminal has never been static. It has always reflected who we are, what we fear, what we value, and what we are trying to protect. Now, let's continue with Part 3.
Part 3. The 1950s. Respectability and Influence.
The 1950s are often remembered as orderly, stable, conformist. But beneath that surface, organized crime matures. The American Mafia consolidates influence in major metropolitan areas: gambling, construction, ports, waste management, transportation. Meanwhile, certain labor unions, including parts of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, become entangled in corruption investigations. It is critical to say carefully, labor movements themselves were not inherently criminal. But where large flows of money and influence exist, infiltration becomes possible. Crime shifts from street confrontation to institutional leverage. Identification methods shift as well. Investigations now rely on Senate hearings, financial tracing, undercover operations, long-term intelligence gathering, and cooperation with the Department of Justice. Crime is no longer always caught in the act. It is uncovered through patterns, through relationships, through influence networks. Oversight becomes institutional and slower. The popular image of 1950s America, one of suburban tranquility, economic prosperity, and social conformity, tells only half the story. While the decade certainly represented a period of unprecedented growth and stability for many, it also witnessed the sophisticated entrenchment of organized crime into the very structures of American commerce and industry. This was the era of the quiet mobster, the violent bootlegger of the 1920s, and the bank-robbing fugitive of the 1930s had evolved into a new breed of criminal. The businessman in a tailored suit. The union official with seemingly legitimate authority. The contractor with political connections. Their violence hadn't disappeared. It had simply become a tool of last resort rather than primary business strategy. The transformation was strategic. Criminal organizations recognized that the greatest profits came not from confronting the system, but from infiltrating it. Why rob a bank when you can own one? Why hijack a truck when you can control the union that determines which trucks get work? Why run illegal gambling operations when you can legalize them through political influence and skim the profits legitimately? By the 1950s, the American mafia had completed its transformation from loosely affiliated street gangs into a sophisticated criminal enterprise with a national reach. The 1950 Appalachian Conference in upstate New York, where dozens of high-ranking mafia leaders were arrested during a meeting, revealed to the public what law enforcement had long suspected. Organized crime was operating as a coordinated national network. This coordination was not aimed at violent crime, but at systematic infiltration of legitimate industries. In New York, the mafia controlled the garment district through systematic extortion and union manipulation. In Chicago, they dominated the hauling and waste management industries, determining which companies received city contracts. In Las Vegas, they used Teamster pension funds to finance casino construction, then skimmed profits before they could be officially recorded. The construction industry became particularly vulnerable. Through control of labor unions and corrupt building inspectors, organized crime could influence which companies won contracts, which materials were used, and how projects were managed. A single major construction project could generate millions in legitimate profits and illegitimate skimmed revenue. The relationship between organized crime and labor unions in the 1950s represents one of the most complex and misunderstood aspects of this era. It is critical to understand that labor movements themselves were not inherently criminal, nor were most union members complicit in corruption. However, certain unions, particularly those with centralized authority and large cash flows became vulnerable to infiltration. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters, under the leadership of Dave Beck and later Jimmy Hoffa, exemplified this vulnerability. The Teamsters controlled massive pension funds, which became sources for loans to mafia-backed businesses. They also controlled hiring halls that could be manipulated to reward loyal companies and punish uncooperative ones. Other unions faced similar challenges. The International Longshoremen's Association controlled waterfront operations in major ports, making them valuable partners for importers looking to avoid customs scrutiny. The United Restaurant Workers and Hotel Employees Union in Las Vegas facilitated mafia control of the burgeoning casino industry. These relationships were symbiotic. Unions gained leverage against employers through mafia-backed intimidation tactics. Organized crime gained legitimate business fronts, access to pension funds, and control over critical industries. The result was a complex web of influence that was difficult to disentangle. If one event symbolizes the shift in crime identification methods in the 1950s, it is the Kefauver Committee hearings. Officially known as the Senate Special Committee to Investigate Crime in Interstate Commerce, these hearings, chaired by Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver, brought organized crime into American living rooms through the new medium of television. From 1950 to 1951, the committee held hearings in 14 cities, questioning over 600 witnesses, including mobsters, politicians, and law enforcement officials. The televised proceedings created a new form of public oversight, the spectacle of powerful criminals being questioned under oath in a national forum. The hearings accomplished several things simultaneously. They educated the public about the sophisticated nature of organized crime. They exposed connections between criminal enterprises and legitimate businesses. They created political pressure for more effective law enforcement responses. And they established a new method of investigation, the public hearing, as a tool for pattern identification and relationship mapping. As crime became more sophisticated, so did investigation methods. The 1950s saw the emergence of financial investigation as a primary tool for identifying criminal enterprises. Rather than catching criminals in the act of violence or theft, investigators began to focus on the financial networks that supported criminal operations. This approach required new expertise. Accountants became as valuable to investigations as detectives. Tax records, bank statements, and corporate filings became evidence. The Department of Justice, particularly under Attorney General Herbert Brownell, began developing specialized units focused on financial crimes. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. If you can't prove the underlying criminal activity, prove the financial crime. Tax evasion became a powerful tool against organized crime figures whose legitimate income couldn't explain their lifestyle. Al Capone had been convicted of tax evasion in 1931, but the 1950s saw this approach systematized and expanded. The 1950s also witnessed the refinement of undercover operations as a law enforcement tool. Rather than observing criminal activity from the outside, agents began infiltrating criminal organizations to gather intelligence from within. This approach required significant patience and sophistication. An undercover agent might spend years establishing credibility within a criminal enterprise slowly gaining access to inner circles and sensitive information. The risk was significant, but the payoff could be extraordinary. A comprehensive understanding of criminal operations that could never be gathered through external observation alone. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which would later become part of the Drug Enforcement Administration, became particularly skilled at this approach, developing long-term undercover operations against drug trafficking organizations. These techniques would later be adapted for use against organized crime. Where the Kefauver Committee had focused broadly on organized crime, the McClellan Committee, officially known as the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor or Management, focused specifically on corruption in labor unions. Chaired by Arkansas Senator John L. McClellan and featuring Robert F. Kennedy as chief counsel, the committee conducted extensive investigations from 1957 to 1959. The committee's hearings exposed the complex relationships between organized crime and certain labor unions, particularly the Teamsters. The testimony of witnesses like Jimmy Hoffa, who invoked the Fifth Amendment 140 times, and Edward Teddy Glickman, who provided detailed information about mafia infiltration of unions, created a public record of these relationships. The committee's work led to the Landrum-Griffin Act of 1959, which regulated union elections and financial practices. More significantly, it established a new approach to investigating institutional corruption. Using congressional oversight as a tool for identifying patterns and relationships that might not constitute specific criminal violations, but nonetheless indicated systemic problems. The most fundamental transformation in crime identification during the 1950s was the shift from focusing on specific criminal events to identifying criminal patterns. Where once investigators had focused on bank robberies or smuggling operations, they now began examining business relationships, financial transactions, and organizational structures. This approach required new tools. Network analysis, though not yet called by that name, became essential. Investigators created charts and diagrams showing connections between individuals, businesses, and organizations. They tracked the flow of money through complex corporate structures. They identified patterns of behavior that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The methodology was slower and more resource-intensive than traditional investigation. It required specialized expertise in accounting, business law, and organizational dynamics. But it was also more effective against sophisticated criminal enterprises that had learned to avoid obvious criminal behavior while still profiting from illicit activities. As crime became more institutionalized, so did oversight. The 1950s saw the creation of specialized units within the Department of Justice and the FBI focused specifically on organized crime. These units developed expertise in financial investigation, undercover operations, and long-term intelligence gathering. This institutionalization had both advantages and disadvantages. The advantage was consistency and continuity. Specialized units could develop institutional knowledge that wouldn't be lost when personnel changed. They could establish long-term investigations that spanned years rather than weeks. The disadvantage was bureaucracy. As oversight became more institutional, it also became more procedural. Investigations required extensive documentation and approval. Decision-making became more centralized. The agility that had characterized earlier law enforcement efforts was sometimes lost in layers of bureaucracy. Perhaps the greatest challenge facing law enforcement in the 1950s was the respectability that criminal organizations had cultivated. The mobster in a business suit who owned legitimate companies, donated to charity, and participated in civic affairs was far more difficult to prosecute than the violent gangster of previous decades. This respectability created a legal shield. Criminal enterprises could use legitimate business structures to conceal illicit activities. They could employ lawyers and accountants to ensure their operations complied with the letter of the law, if not the spirit. They could use political influence to shape regulations in ways that benefited their operations. The result was a form of crime that was simultaneously more sophisticated and more difficult to identify. It required new investigative methods and a different kind of oversight, one focused on patterns rather than events, relationships rather than transactions, and influence rather than violence. The 1950s marked a fundamental transformation in both crime and its identification. As criminal enterprises became more sophisticated and institutionalized, oversight became more procedural and bureaucratic. The era of catching criminals in the act was giving way to the era of uncovering criminal patterns. But this new approach would face new challenges as crime evolved yet again, becoming even more abstract and difficult to trace. The journey from bootleggers to bureaucracy was entering a new phase.
Part 4. The 1960s through the 1970s. Fracture and Intelligence.
The nation experiences social upheaval, civil rights protests, political assassinations, urban unrest, radical movements. Distrust of institutions grows. Law enforcement expands surveillance. Wiretaps increase. A brief reflection here. This era was particularly thorny to write and research. History is messy. For many Americans, this was the moment when trust in institutions began to fracture. The tools designed to protect the nation were also capable of watching it. Intelligence coordination improves. Federal authority centralizes further. Crime is now sometimes ideological, sometimes political, sometimes organized. Identification relies on intelligence files, coordinated federal-state efforts, and expanded prosecutorial reach. Crime is identified through information networks. Oversight becomes intelligence-driven. And with that expansion comes controversy, because every expansion of oversight raises questions about limits. History teaches us that tools of enforcement must themselves be governed. The 1960s and 1970s represent perhaps the most turbulent period in modern American history. The nation experienced profound social and political transformations that challenged its foundational institutions. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963, followed by those of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy in 1968, created a sense of national crisis and vulnerability. Simultaneously, the civil rights movement gained momentum, challenging segregation and systemic racism. The Vietnam War sparked widespread anti-war protests, particularly on college campuses. Urban centers experienced riots and unrest, often in response to racial tensions and economic inequality. Radical movements emerged on both the left and right, from the Weather Underground and Black Panther Party to various white supremacist organizations. This social upheaval created what law enforcement perceived as new threats to national security and public order. The traditional distinctions between criminal activity, political dissent, and foreign subversion began to blur in the minds of those tasked with protecting the nation. This perception would drive a dramatic expansion of surveillance and intelligence capabilities. As the nature of perceived threats evolved, so did the methods of identification and investigation. Law enforcement agencies increasingly adopted intelligence-gathering techniques traditionally associated with national security operations. This transformation represented a fundamental shift in American policing, from reactive investigation of completed crimes to proactive surveillance of potentially threatening groups and individuals. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover's continued leadership, dramatically expanded its surveillance capabilities. The Bureau wiretapped phones and opened mail without warrants, and it placed more than 50,000 human informers or infiltrators inside political groups. By the 1960s, the Bureau had recruited an estimated 5 to 10% of the membership of the Communist Party of the United States to supply information about meetings, finances, literature, and organizing. This intelligence-driven approach was not limited to the FBI. The Central Intelligence Agency, created by the National Security Act of 1947, increasingly engaged in domestic surveillance, despite its statutory mandate to focus on foreign intelligence. The National Security Agency, created by secret presidential directive in 1952, soon grew into a vast intelligence-gathering machine which spread ever deeper into Americans' private lives and communications. Perhaps the most notorious example of this intelligence turn was the FBI's counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO. Initially created in 1956 to disrupt the Communist Party USA, COINTELPRO expanded in the 1960s to target a wide range of domestic organizations perceived as threatening to the established order. COINTELPRO continued into the late 1960s and early 1970s, seeking to disrupt radical movements and, at times, endorsing police violence against its targets. The program employed a range of tactics, including psychological warfare, infiltration through informants, and agents provocateurs, legal harassment, and extra-legal force and violence. The program targeted civil rights organizations, anti-war activists, the Black Panther Party, and other groups. Wiretapping emerged as a particularly controversial tool during this period. By 1965, the normative political position in the United States was that wiretapping for national security was a necessary evil, whereas wiretapping in the service of the enforcement of criminal law, in, say, tax evasion cases, or even in mafia prosecutions, which was a big priority among American law enforcement starting in the 1960s, was considered outrageous and an abuse of power. The FBI had gained some important new tools to go after mobsters by 1970, including court-authorized wiretaps, jurisdiction over mob-infiltrated businesses, and the ability to target entire crime families and their leaders instead of just bit players and isolated wise guys. Wiretapping and electronic eavesdropping was highly individualized up until the 1980s. Law enforcement was tapping individual telephones and listening to individual conversations. Now, as a result of the rise of data valence in particular, We're talking about a scale of surveillance that scarcely seems fathomable from the perspective of the 1960s, 1970s, or even the 1980s. The expansion of surveillance capabilities reached its apex with the notorious Huston Plan, prepared by representatives of the White House and the U.S. intelligence community in 1970. The plan envisioned a smorgasbord of covert operations that made even FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover queasy. Following Attorney General John Mitchell's request to meet with Hoover, CIA Director Richard Helms, and NSA Director Noel Gaylor, FBI officials speculated that the subject to be discussed would have to do with the monitoring of criminal subversives such as the Weathermen, Black Panthers, and other radical militants. They prepared talking points and attached a list of those whom the FBI had wiretapped. The plan represented a dramatic expansion of domestic surveillance capabilities, raising serious constitutional questions about privacy and government overreach. It reflected the Nixon administration's willingness to use intelligence agencies for political purposes, a tendency that would later be exposed during the Watergate hearings. The excesses of this era eventually led to a backlash and a reassertion of oversight. In the mid-1970s, the Church Committee conducted a far-reaching Senate investigation into U.S. intelligence agencies, including the NSA. Chaired by Senator Frank Church, the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities exposed numerous abuses of power. The committee's investigations revealed details about operations like the NSA's Operation Shamrock, which intercepted millions of telegrams to and from the United States. The committee's work led to significant reforms, including the creation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, or the FISA Court, to provide judicial oversight of foreign intelligence surveillance activities. The Church Committee's work represented a crucial moment in the history of American surveillance, the recognition that even intelligence agencies must operate within legal and constitutional boundaries. Though at times frustratingly opaque, the FISA Court provides at least some level of control previously lacking in domestic intelligence affairs. The revelations of the 1970s led to significant legislative attempts to balance security needs with privacy protections. The Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, aka the Wiretap Statute, mandated the requirement for probable cause and individual warrants. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, of 1978 sought to provide judicial and congressional oversight of foreign intelligence surveillance activities in response to the exposure of abuses of U.S. intelligence agencies. The Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986 extended restrictions on government wiretaps of telephone calls to include transmissions of electronic data by computer. These legal frameworks represented attempts to establish clear boundaries for surveillance activities while preserving the government's ability to protect national security. They reflected the ongoing tension between security needs and constitutional protections that would continue to shape surveillance practices in subsequent decades. The expansion of surveillance and intelligence capabilities in the 1960s and 1970s left a complex legacy. On one hand, these tools provided law enforcement with new methods for identifying and disrupting both criminal enterprises and potential threats to national security. The FBI's ability to target entire crime families rather than just individual criminals represented a significant advancement in combating organized crime. On the other hand, the abuse of these tools created a deep and lasting distrust of intelligence agencies among many Americans. The surveillance of political activists, the infiltration of lawful organizations, and the use of intelligence capabilities for political purposes raised serious questions about the proper role of surveillance in a democratic society. These tensions remain unresolved today. The definition of domestic terrorists expanded over time to include peaceful protesters of many different backgrounds. The 1960s and 1970s witnessed a fundamental transformation in how crime was identified and investigated. Where once identification had relied primarily on physical evidence and eyewitness testimony, it now increasingly depended on intelligence files, coordinated federal-state efforts, and expanded prosecutorial reach. Crime was identified through information networks rather than through physical presence. Oversight became intelligence-driven rather than purely reactive. This transformation allowed law enforcement to address more sophisticated and complex criminal enterprises, but it also raised new questions about privacy, civil liberties, and government accountability. The era established patterns that would continue to shape surveillance and investigation practices in subsequent decades. The tension between security and privacy, between intelligence gathering and constitutional protections, would remain a defining feature of American law enforcement and national security policy. The controversies of the 1960s and 1970s left unanswered questions that continue to resonate today. How can a democratic society balance the need for security with the protection of civil liberties? What proper role should intelligence agencies play in domestic law enforcement? How can oversight mechanisms ensure that surveillance tools are not abused for political purposes? These questions gained new urgency in the aftermath of the September 11, 2001 attacks, when surveillance capabilities expanded dramatically once again. The historical lessons of the 1960s and 1970s serve as both a warning and a guide. Warning against the dangers of unchecked surveillance while pointing towards solutions that balance security needs with constitutional protections. The expansion of oversight during this period taught us that tools of enforcement must themselves be governed. It demonstrated that even in times of national crisis, democratic societies must maintain vigilance against the abuse of power. These lessons remain relevant as we continue to grapple with the appropriate boundaries of surveillance and intelligence gathering in an increasingly complex world. The 1960s and 1970s marked a turning point in the relationship between crime and oversight, a shift from reactive investigation to proactive surveillance, from local enforcement to centralized intelligence. This transformation would face new challenges in subsequent decades as crime became increasingly global and digital. The journey from bootleggers to bureaucracy was entering a new phase, with technology creating both new opportunities for criminal enterprise and new tools for law enforcement.
Chicken honey, wonderful food for you.
Fried chicken and hickory barbecue.
Piping hot,
Handy home delivery.
quick as a bunny. Catering service at Chicken Honey. Carry out service too.
Chicken Honey is open 6 days a week to welcome you.
You're always welcome.
So quick as a bunny, call Chicken Honey. Phone 50006
In the city, enjoy Chicken Honey. Call Chicken Honey right now. quick as a bunny called Chicken Holly.
Phone 50006 in the city for carry-out service right on the dot.
Catering service right on the spot.
Quick home delivery, piping hot.
Just as you want it, enjoy Chicken Honey called Chicken Honey right now.
Everywhere you go, across the country trip or across the street party, you carry the fun with you when you own a Columbia stereophonic high-fidelity phonograph. There's a marvelous selection of 7 new portable models in smart new color combinations at your Columbia phonograph dealer from which you may choose. Each one is a masterpiece of design and beauty. More quality, more features, and more styling have been built into these sturdy portables than ever before. How much fun you'll have enjoying all the wonderful new sound of stereo records. Regular records take on new beauty, too, when played on handsome Columbia portables. You'll be amazed at the big console sound that is reproduced by Columbia portable stereophonic high-fidelity phonographs. You'll thrill to the excitement of Stereo One by Columbia, #1 in the wonderful world of sound. And Columbia portables are economical, too. Prices start as low as $24.95. See them and hear them at your Columbia phonograph dealer.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard this historic tour flight. This is your flight attendant speaking. Please turn on all personal podcast playing electronic devices and fasten your seatbelts as we're expecting some turbulence over the middle of our country. From there, we might stop over in Iowa for a spellbinding weekend before making our final descent into Mobile, Alabama in the mid-19th century. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy your historic tour with the Preservation Oaks podcast.
There's another way to get away and relax anytime you like. Just listen to another episode of the Preservation Oaks podcast. It's free, and it's an excellent way to enjoy the history and uniqueness of our country. The tour is on us. Enjoy.
Susan, my dear, the moment I laid eyes on you, I knew. You were the one.
Ooh! I don't know what to say.
It's true love, Susan. There's nothing to say.
Oh, Lim, you've come out of nowhere and swept me off my feet like a
blinking great episode of the Preservation Oaks podcast. Don't miss a moment of Season 5. And if you're headed into history or genealogy land, keep the past between your toes, stay safe, and always listen with a cup of tea.
Visit preservationoaks.podbean.com or wherever you grab your favorite podcasts.
Hello, no one is available to take your call. Please leave a message after the tone.
Hello. Good evening, Mr. Martin. It's Hans here. Sorry to call you at home, but it's about the new building. The new building we had the grand opening for last month. The $125 million building. Well, you know how we here use the metric system, obviously. Turns out the engineers don't. So, because of that, it appears to be leaning somewhat dramatically. We got jacks and might save it yet, but statistically speaking, it's unlikely. So please call me back, please.
Have some unexpected free time coming up soon? Make good use of your free time listening to Preservation Oaks.
And now, back to Preservation Oaks.
Part 5. The 1980s through the 1990s. Scale and Financial Systems.
The late 20th century introduces scale. Drug trafficking expands globally. money laundering networks develop complexity. Cash moves through shell corporations and offshore accounts. The Drug Enforcement Administration works alongside federal prosecutors and financial regulators. Asset forfeiture laws expand. Computers begin assisting investigations. Databases replace filing cabinets. Crime identification increasingly means follow the money. Financial records become central evidence. Suspicious transaction reporting emerges. International banking coordination begins increasing. Crime is identified by financial pattern recognition. Oversight becomes analytical. The 1980s witnessed the emergence of a truly global drug trade, dwarfing previous narcotics operations in both scope and sophistication. The cocaine boom, fueled by cartels in Colombia like the Medellin and Cali cartels, created an unprecedented flow of illicit drugs into the United States. At the same time, heroin trafficking networks expanded from Southeast Asia's Golden Triangle and Southwest Asia's Golden Crescent. This global expansion was made possible by several converging factors. Improved transportation and communication technologies allowed criminal organizations to coordinate activities across continents. The deregulation of financial markets created new opportunities for moving and laundering money. And rising demand in consumer markets, particularly in the United States and Europe, provided enormous profit incentives. The scale of this trade was staggering. By the mid-1980s, the Medellin cartel alone was reportedly earning billions of dollars annually, with its leader, Pablo Escobar, becoming one of the wealthiest men in the world. This wealth translated into power, not just the power to corrupt officials, but the power to challenge governments directly, as seen in Colombia's narco-terrorism campaign. Where drug trafficking created enormous profits, money laundering provided the mechanism to enjoy them. The 1980s and 1990 saw the development of increasingly sophisticated money laundering techniques designed to obscure the origins of illicit funds and integrate them into the legitimate financial system. Criminal organizations employed a range of methods to launder money. They used shell corporations, companies with no real business operations, to create the appearance of legitimate transactions. They invested in cash-intensive businesses like restaurants, bars, and casinos, where illicit funds could be mixed with legitimate revenue. They exploited offshore financial centers in places like the Cayman Islands, Panama, and Switzerland, where banking secrecy laws protected their identities. The complexity of these networks presented a new challenge for law enforcement. Where once investigators could follow physical evidence or eyewitness testimony, they now had to trace financial flows through complex corporate structures and across international borders. This required new expertise in accounting, finance, and international law. The Drug Enforcement Administration, created in 1973 by President Richard Nixon through an executive order that merged several existing agencies, evolved significantly during this period. Initially focused primarily on interdicting drugs and arresting traffickers, the DEA gradually expanded its mandate to include targeting the financial infrastructure of drug trafficking organizations. This evolution reflected a strategic recognition that disrupting the flow of money could be as effective as disrupting the flow of drugs. The DEA began developing specialized units focused on financial investigations, working closely with the Internal Revenue Service, the Department of Justice, and financial regulators to trace and seize illicit funds. The DEA's approach became increasingly sophisticated. Agents learned to analyze financial records, identify patterns of suspicious transactions, and follow money trails through complex corporate structures. They developed expertise in international banking systems and worked with foreign counterparts to trace cross-border financial flows. A pivotal moment in the financial approach to crime came with the passage of the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984. This legislation significantly expanded the asset forfeiture powers of federal law enforcement agencies, allowing them to seize property believed to be connected to criminal activity. The act created new forms of forfeiture, including criminal forfeiture, requiring a conviction, and civil forfeiture, not requiring a conviction. It also established the Assets Forfeiture Fund, which allowed agencies to use seized assets to fund future investigations. This expansion of forfeiture powers transformed law enforcement strategy. Seizing assets became not just a punitive measure, but an investigative tool, disrupting criminal organizations by targeting their financial infrastructure. The approach proved particularly effective against organized crime groups, which often depended on accumulated wealth to maintain their operations. The foundation for modern financial investigation was laid earlier with the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970, but its implementation and expansion in the 1980s and 1990s were crucial to developing analytical oversight. The act required financial institutions to maintain records and file reports that could be useful in criminal, tax, and regulatory investigations. Key provisions of the act included the Currency Transaction Report, requiring financial institutions to file reports for cash transactions exceeding $10,000, and the Report of International Transportation of Currency or Monetary Instruments, requiring reports for transporting more than $10,000 into or out of the country. These requirements created a financial paper trail that investigators could analyze to identify patterns of suspicious activity. They also established a legal framework for cooperation between financial institutions and law enforcement agencies. The Annunzio Wiley Anti-Money Laundering Act of 1992 strengthened the Bank Secrecy Act framework by requiring financial institutions to develop and implement anti-money laundering compliance programs. It also prohibited financial institutions from allowing customers to keep their identities anonymous when opening accounts. Perhaps most significantly, the act required the Treasury Department to develop suspicious activity reporting procedures. This resulted in the creation of the Suspicious Activity Report, which allowed financial institutions to report transactions that they believed might involve funds from illegal activities or attempts to structure transactions to avoid reporting requirements. The SAR system became a crucial tool for identifying potential money laundering activities. By analyzing patterns in SAR filings, investigators could identify networks of accounts and transactions that might be related to criminal enterprises. The 1980s and 1990s witnessed a revolution in law enforcement technology. Computers began replacing filing cabinets. Databases replaced paper records, and software programs assisted investigators in analyzing vast amounts of financial data. The DEA and other agencies developed specialized databases to track information about drug traffickers, money launderers, and their associates. These systems allowed investigators to quickly search and cross-reference information, identifying connections that might have been missed in manual reviews of paper files. The computer revolution also enabled new analytical techniques. Investigators could now use software to identify patterns in financial transactions, visualize complex networks of relationships, and track the flow of funds through multiple accounts and institutions. Recognizing that money laundering was an international problem requiring international solutions, the G7 countries established the Financial Action Task Force in 1989. This intergovernmental body was tasked with developing standards and promoting effective implementation of legal, regulatory, and operational measures to combat money laundering. The Financial Action Task Force's 40 recommendations, issued in 1990 and subsequently revised, provided a comprehensive framework for anti-money laundering efforts. They covered areas including customer identification, record-keeping, reporting of suspicious transactions, international cooperation, and legal measures. The establishment of the Financial Action Task Force marked a significant step in international coordination against financial crime. It created a mechanism for sharing best practices, assessing compliance, and applying pressure to jurisdictions that failed to implement adequate anti-money laundering measures. Perhaps the most fundamental transformation in crime identification during this period was the shift from reactive investigation to proactive analysis. Where once investigators had primarily responded to completed crimes, they now increasingly used financial pattern recognition to identify ongoing criminal enterprises. This analytical approach required new skills and new tools. Investigators needed expertise in accounting, finance, and data analysis. They needed access to sophisticated software systems that could handle large volumes of financial data. They needed the ability to identify meaningful patterns in complex webs of transactions. The approach proved particularly effective against sophisticated criminal organizations that had learned to avoid obvious criminal behavior. By analyzing financial patterns, investigators could identify the underlying infrastructure of these organizations even when specific criminal acts couldn't be directly observed. The financial approach to crime identification, developed in the 1980s and 1990s, had a profound impact on law enforcement. It provided new tools for disrupting criminal organizations, even when traditional investigative methods proved ineffective. It created partnerships between law enforcement and financial institutions that continue to this day. However, this approach also raised new questions and challenges. The expansion of forfeiture powers raised concerns about due process and property rights. The collection of financial data raised privacy questions. The focus on financial patterns sometimes overlooked the human impact of criminal enterprises. These tensions would become more apparent in subsequent decades as technology continued to evolve and financial crimes became increasingly sophisticated. The analytical methods developed in this period would be adapted and expanded to address new challenges, from cybercrime to international terrorism. The 1980s and 1990s witnessed a fundamental transformation in how crime was identified and investigated. Where once investigators had relied primarily on physical evidence and eyewitness testimony, they now increasingly depended on financial records, data analysis, and international cooperation. This transformation reflected the changing nature of criminal enterprise itself. As crime became more sophisticated and globalized, so did the methods needed to identify and combat it. The financial trail became as important as the physical trail, and analytical skills became as valuable as investigative instincts. The era established patterns that would continue to shape financial investigation in subsequent decades. The partnership between law enforcement and financial institutions, the use of data analysis to identify patterns, and the international coordination against financial crime would all be further developed in the 21st century. The 1980s and 1990s marked a turning point in the relationship between crime and oversight, a shift from physical investigation to financial analysis, from local enforcement to international coordination. This transformation would face new challenges in subsequent decades as crime became increasingly digital and decentralized. The journey from bootleggers to bureaucracy was entering a new phase, with technology creating both new opportunities for criminal enterprise and new tools for law enforcement.
As we bring part 1 of episode 123 to a close, we've traveled across decades of change, from a time when crime had faces, names, and neighborhoods, to an era where entire systems began to take shape in response. We saw the rise of national enforcement in the 1930s, the influence and respectability that masked criminal enterprise in the 1950s, and the fractures of the 1960s and 70s that gave rise to intelligence-driven policing. And by the time we reached the 1980s and 1990s, crime had evolved yet again, scaling into global financial systems, moving not just through streets and cities, but through banks, networks, and institutions. What becomes clear is this: crime never stands still. It adapts, it studies, it evolves, often just one step ahead of the systems designed to stop it. But what we've covered so far is only part of the story, because in the decades that follow, everything changes. Crime leaves the physical world behind and becomes digital, borderless, instantaneous, and in many ways far more difficult to see. In part 2 of episode 123, we move into the 21st century, where systems themselves become the target, where artificial intelligence begins to reshape both crime and enforcement, and where nations are forced to work together in ways never before imagined. We'll explore the digital transformation of crime, the vulnerabilities of modern infrastructure, the emerging questions surrounding AI, and the growing need for international cooperation in a connected world. That final chapter is coming next week, so be sure to join us for part 2 from Bootleggers to Bureaucracy, the history of crime, 1926 to 2026. All right, that's a wrap for this episode. Music used today is from Cymbalbird, Track Tribe, Anthem of Rain, and the 126ers. Hey, this is Sean Radcliffe. See you all next time on Preservation Oaks. And until then, keep on giving and keep on living the good life.
You can visit at www.microstreamradio.com. This broadcast is owned and copyrighted by Microstream Radio. It cannot be rebroadcast, downloaded, reproduced, copied, or used anywhere without the written permission of Microstream Radio. Preservation Oaks starring Sean Radcliffe originates in Salt Lake City, Utah, Be sure to join us for our next episode on your favorite podcast platform. This is Sarah Suarez speaking. Preservation Oaks has come to you through the worldwide podcast platform Podbean, and our home is preservationoaks.podbean.com. Hopefully you found today's episode useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If so, please like, follow, comment, and/or subscribe. Remember that being free means being free to be curious, and that historical and genealogical societies and museums allow us to discover the past, be free to explore, where curiosity opens every door. Thanks to everyone for listening. Stay cozy, curious, and keep exploring the incredible stories that shape our world. Remember to cherish and support the preservation of history in your own communities. The content of this program is provided for educational and informational purposes only. Some material included in this program may be copyrighted by third parties. However, under Section 107 of the U.S. Copyright Act, the doctrine of fair use allows the limited use of copyrighted material without requiring permission from the rights holders when used for purposes such as education, criticism, commentary, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. These uses are legally permitted even if they might otherwise constitute infringement. If you wish to use copyrighted material from this program for purposes beyond fair use, you must obtain permission from the copyright owner. If you believe your copyrighted material has been used in this program in a way that does not qualify as fair use, please contact us at Preservation Oaks.